Hey guys, tonight we begin with the hush of a world built on power and pain. By the time most people heard of Rome, it had already become legend. Marble cities, golden armor, speeches that echoed in stone forums. But that's not where you'd be somewhere far quieter and colder. A latrine, a wine shop's back room, a widow's smoke-dark kitchen. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because tonight, we won't be marching with generals or plotting with senators. We'll be crouching beside a cracked hearth where smoke never quite leaves the lungs. We'll be hauling water uphill in a clay pot that's already chipped. We'll be mending a tunic by candlelight, not because it's noble, but because there's no other one. This story isn't told in bronze inscriptions. It's scratched into the grooves of old wood, pressed into the soles of worn sandals, swept into corners with ashes and crumbs. We'll meet no one famous here, but we will linger with the ones who stirred porridge, whispered to sick children, folded rough wool blankets, and offered the last crust of bread to someone hungrier than themselves. There's no glory here. Only survival, and the small softness of staying human when nothing around you is. The Roman Empire was vast, yes, but for most, it narrowed down to a single dark room, shared with too many bodies and not enough warmth. And in that room, life wasn't epic, it was quiet, tiring, tender in places, and somehow it endured. So tonight we begin not with the empire's triumphs, but with its silence. Not with its noise, but with the hush beneath it. The hush of sore limbs, dim oil lamps, and prayers said to gods too tired to listen. This is the Rome that crushed without a word, and yet people whispered through it anyway. Let's begin. It's morning, but not the kind with birdsong and golden light. This Roman morning begins with boots scraping over broken stone, and a mother trying to coax warmth from yesterday's fire ash. The coals didn't last the night. Neither did the quiet. You live above the street, but only barely. Your window, if you have one, is little more than a wooden flap. Through the cracks the city yawns itself awake, not gently, but with the clatter of carts and a vendor yelling about bad fish like it's good news. Down below, a boy with scabs on his knees chases a dog with no tail. A woman empties a pot of waste into the gutter with a practiced flick of her wrist. It hits the stone with a soft splash. Someone curses. No one looks up. This is Rome, not the Rome of triumphal arches and togas crisp as scrolls, but the Rome of puddles that never quite dry, of bread so dry it must be soaked in wine to be chewed, of tenement walls stained with time and cooking smoke and sorrow. You don't see the palaces from here. You see sandals with worn leather straps. You see fingers missing tips. You see teeth that left early and never came back. Even the air feels tired. It hangs low, warm with breath, sour with vinegar, fish brine and old sweat. But it's familiar, and in its own strange way, comforting. You know this air. You grew up in it. Above you, birds circle, but not the kind that sing. These ones look for scraps, bones, bits, crusts. Much like everyone else, the street is alive, but not with celebration. It buzzes with the business of barely getting by. A butcher wipes his blade on a filthy apron and smiles with half his teeth. A child trades figs for eggs. A beggar mutters prayers no one answers. You step into it with practiced indifference, not because you don't care, but because caring takes energy. And energy, like everything else, is rationed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave. A soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Your tunic itches. It's been worn all week, maybe longer. You stopped counting days when the weather turned warm. That was 3 jobs ago, or maybe 4. Someone spits. A baby cries. A wine cellar calls out the price of a cup no bigger than your thumb. You pass by it all, not rushing, not strolling, just moving. That's enough, that's all anyone's doing. Rome, from the forums and scrolls, was built to dazzle. But you don't live in the dazzle. You live where the dazzle dumps its leftovers. The marble steps. They're slippery with pigeon droppings. The statues chipped. The columns, impressive only until you need somewhere to urinate. You pass a group of men leaning against one, laughing through cracked lips. You don't know the joke. You don't want to. Laughter here is a luxury, and today you can't afford it. A bread queue snakes along the alley. People pretend they're not looking at each other's hands, but they are. Checking who might be weaker, who might give up, who might drop their ration. It's not cruel, it's survival, softened by habit. The sun climbs, but the street doesn't brighten. It stays dusty, dim. No matter the season, the tall buildings drink the light before it touches the stones. So you walk in a half shadow, your thoughts echoing beneath the buzz of the city's groaning belly. There's warmth sometimes. A man shares his stool with his son. A girl sings to herself while fetching water. Someone leaves a plum on a doorstep, unclaimed. Small things. Easy to miss if you blink too fast, but you don't blink fast anymore. You've learned to see what matters. A clean corner of cloth. A bucket that doesn't leak. A neighbor who doesn't shout. At noon a breeze stirs the filth and someone lights a brazier. Not for heat, for the scent. To cover what can't be scrubbed. The smoke curls into your nose like a memory. You're not sure if it's sweet or sour. The crowd thickens, a cart overturns, a chicken escapes, a boy runs. Someone laughs, actually laughs, and for a moment it's almost music. But then the magistrate's guards pass through, their sandals slapping stone in stiff unison. The noise stills. People bow their heads, not in respect, but in calculation. It's safer not to be noticed. The guards are gone as quickly as they came, and the street exhales. You hear it, a collective breath, as though the city itself has learned to hold its lungs in the presence of power. A man slips on a melon rind and curses the gods. A girl tugs at her mother's sleeve, pointing at a painted puppet behind a curtain. You keep walking. By evening, the street has changed its skin. Vendors pack up, children hush. Lamps flicker in windows high above. Small yellow stars in the city's murky sky. You pass under them, your feet sore, your shoulders low, your stomach only half full. But it's enough. Home is still 3 alleys away. But you know the cracks, in the walls by heart. You know which door creaks, which cat bites, which step is loose, and as the street quiets, the filth doesn't vanish, but it softens. The stink is less sharp, the shadows less crowded. You don't love this place, but you understand it. You've seen how it holds the broken things together, not with pride, not with polish, but with familiarity, with the kind of closeness that only hardship can weave. And in the soft dark beneath the marble, Rome breathes, not like an empire, but like 100,000 people just trying to fall asleep. There's no such thing as breakfast. Not really. Not in the way we think of it. Not with choices or freshness or smiles around a table. Here in the hush of a Roman tenement, the day starts with the stomach. Not its fullness, but its ache. You wake slowly. Not because you've rested, but because you didn't sleep deeply enough to dream. The floor beneath you is straw and dust. The air smells faintly of smoke and someone else's breath. Above, a wooden beam creaks with the shifting weight of neighbors. Too many for the space, too quiet for comfort. A baby whimpers. Someone coughs. You sit up. Your bones do the talking. Teumaa. Hearth is empty. It always is by morning. Ash in the center, cold stone around it. But on the shelf, if no one touched it in the night, is a loaf. Or what's left of it. You reach for it gently, the way you'd touch a fragile thing. It's not soft, it hasn't been for days. But it holds. Bread here always holds. Longer than your patience, longer than your plans. A sliver of oil waits. In a clay bowl, thickened at the edges, catching the morning light like a trickle of gold pretending to be generous. You dip the bread, chew slowly. It's not a meal. It's a negotiation with your hunger. The walls around you are close, not quite leaning but tired. Cracks run through them like veins, and from one of them, as usual, a roach emerges. Antennae twitching like it's asking permission. You don't scream, you don't swat. You just watch it move, casual as breath, slipping back into the place it came from. It's part of the house, really. It's survived more than you have. The bread is gone too quickly. The oil leaves a trace on your lips. You wipe it with your sleeve. And now there's nothing left on the shelf but the echo of appetite. The window doesn't open. It never has. But a breeze finds its way in anyway. Cool, unwelcome, honest. It reminds you the day has started, whether you're ready or not. You glance at the shelf again. It's bare, except for a pinch of salt in a folded scrap of cloth. You could crush it over the fireless hearth, pretend it's seasoning. Pretend you're a cook, not a survivor. In the corner, a clay jug leans under its own emptiness. Water's far. The aqueducts might carry it in, but never to this floor, not to this room. The good pipes go elsewhere. You tie your tunic. It's still damp from yesterday's sweat. The fabric sticks near the shoulders. You pull it loose. The only sound is the rope tightening at your waist and the slight shuffle of feet above. Sometimes you think of olives, the rich ones, black and glossy, split open with a bite. You saw them once at a stall near the Forum. A man sliced one open and let the brine run over his thumb. You can still see the shine. That memory feeds you, more than this bread ever could. There's a rhythm to the day that no one speaks of, a silent procession from hunger to movement, from movement to fatigue, from fatigue back to hunger. You follow it without thinking, and when the sun finds your wall striking the plaster with a brief warm smear, you pause. It's not light enough to read by, not that you read, but it brightens the dust. You can see it spinning in the air like gold flakes, falling, lifting, falling again. You exhale. Dust dances in your breath, and for a moment you almost smile. It's not beautiful, but it's something. In the streets, someone is yelling again. That's the next part of the day. The noise, the push, the weight of other people's needs, crashing into your own. But for now the room is yours, and the silence, if not kind, is at least familiar. There's a chipped bowl by the wall. A mouse was in it last night. You didn't stop it, it was hungry too. You sit back down, the fire still hasn't started. You trace the stone with your toe, feel the cool, the absence. You think of last week, when someone brought figs. Just 3, overripe. One with a wasp still inside it. You laugh then. The first real laugh in days. Even now the memory has weight, but today there's no fruit, just the memory of it, and a bit of flour clinging to the cracks in your hands, like pale dirt that never washes out. The jug groans when you lift it, still empty. You carry it anyway. That's what the day will be about now. Carrying. Bread, water, scraps. Yourself. Down. The stairs, the smell thickens, not bad, just real, mold, feet, damp wool, but also wood smoke, soap root, maybe even onions, and suddenly the day doesn't seem impossible. Just long, just hard, just Roman. The oil in your stomach barely reaches. The bones. But you walk steady, careful not to step where the stone dips inward from use. You know these hollows. You grew into them. And at the bottom someone's frying something. You don't look. You just breathe deeper, like that might be enough. Sometimes it is. You'd think a bath would be a luxury, that it might bring warmth, maybe even calm. But in the Roman world it was just another task, another place to be surrounded, watched, judged, touched, steamed open, scrubbed raw, and sent out into the same dirt you came in with. You step into the bathhouse just after noon. The light is different here, thick with mist, filtered through arches and tasting faintly of lime and old sweat. There's no quiet. The air is crowded with sound, water trickling, voices echoing, a bucket falling. Laughter too, but never yours. The warmth hits first. Not pleasant warmth, but the kind that clings. Heavy, saturated. A warmth you don't trust, why because it doesn't last. You paid to get in, though barely. A copper coin slid into the calloused hand of a boy no older than your nephew. He didn't speak. Just nodded you in the way all boys in cheap tunics do when they've seen too much already. You strip with your eyes on the floor. Not because you're ashamed, but because everyone does. The stone beneath your feet is slick. Not with water. Not just with water. There are stains in the corners. You don't ask what made them. The bench is still warm from the last body. You sit anyway, that's the way of it. Nothing in this room is truly yours, not even the steam curling around your knees. A man coughs behind you. Someone laughs. There's an argument near the far pool. Loud words about money, maybe a debt. You close your eyes. Not to block them out, but to stay still. You feel the heat press into your shoulders, softening the knots that sleep in your muscles. It's not kind, just efficient. A bucket clangs. A boy pours water over your back. It's too hot and your skin flinches. But you don't speak. That's part of the ritual. accepting discomfort like it's something earned. You soap yourself with a paste that smells of olive and ash. It stings a little in the cuts you forgot about, the ones on your hands from carrying too much or slipping or living. You rinse. The water pools at your feet before disappearing into the dark slit in the floor. It carries pieces of you with bits of skin, dirt, maybe even the tiredness in your bones, though that's probably wishful thinking. Someone passes behind you. Their hip brushes yours. No one says sorry. No one ever does here. Touch is just part of the air, like heat or noise. The pool steams gently. It looks clean from afar, but you know better. You watch bubbles rise from nowhere. You don't ask. You never ask. A man slides in beside you. Thick arms, a face like boiled leather. He nods once. You nod back. No names, no words. Just two humans, pretending this heat makes them whole again. You wonder briefly how many bodies the water has held. Hundreds? Thousands? The thought is too large, so you shrink it. Think instead of the tile beneath your feet, tiny mosaics, faded fish, swimming. Nowhere. You press your toes to one and imagine it's real. There's a rhythm to the bathhouse: pour, scrub, steam, soak, leave. It repeats like a chant. No joy in it, just habit. You move through the stages because that's what's expected. You finish. You'll scrub. Your back aches, your knees complain. But your skin is cleaner than it's been all week. That's something. You wrap yourself in cloth, damp, rough. You don't own oil, so you dry quickly. The warmth clings for a while, but you know it won't last past the door. Someone jokes about a woman in the caldarium. Loud, crude, you hear. Laughter that stings like soap in the eyes. She laughs too, a little too sharply, but her voice shakes and you know it wasn't funny. You pass her near the exit. She won't meet your gaze. You don't offer it. Outside, the air slaps you. Not hard, but sharp enough. Cold settles into your damp tunic with a hunger of its own. You breathe it in like punishment, like permission. You don't feel cleaner, not really, just emptied, but maybe that's enough. The bathhouse isn't a sanctuary. It's a stage, and everyone performs their weariness like a ritual. Splash, scrub, pretend, repeat. You walk home with wet hair clinging to your neck. A drop runs down your spine and vanishes into your belt line. You don't flinch. You're used to things crawling, falling, slipping into places they don't belong. By the time you reach the tenement, the sweat has returned. Light at first, just under your arms. The filth never really leaves. It just moves around. But still, you bathed. You did the thing. You shared the space. You endured the ritual. And tomorrow, when someone leans too close or when the fishmonger wrinkles his nose, you can say, quietly, if only to yourself, I went. I bathed. I was clean for a moment. And in a city where nothing stays, clean for long, a moment is worth more than gold. No one speaks of the latrine, not in poems, not in statues, not in the soaring marble inscriptions that wrap around columns like proud ribbons. But every Roman used one. The rich, the poor, the nameless, the mighty, because even empires need places to kneel and empty themselves. And this was that place. You walk in with a practiced breath. The smell hits first, of course. Earthy, sour, human, a scent that clings even to memory. There's no door, only a heavy curtain pulled to one side, damp with mildew. It waves slightly as someone leaves as you enter. Inside it's dim. Light filters in through high slits, like embarrassed glances. The stone is worn smooth by centuries of bare skin. A long bench of cool marble hugs the wall, evenly spaced with holes, like a flute made for no music at all. There is no privacy. You sit beside strangers, knees brushing, robes hiking. You both pretend not to notice. One man hums, another coughs. A third reads graffiti on the wall, mouthing it silently, as if the crude scratchings might offer wisdom. You look down. There is water faintly moving. Not clean, never clean, just present. Trickling beneath you in a channel carved to carry away shame. A sponge on a stick sits near your foot. It's been used, rinsed, used again. You don't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, you watch the way sunlight touches the edge of the stone, a golden warmth that has no business being here, but somehow softens the indignity. Someone chuckles low and bitter. He says something about Caesar never sitting here. He's wrong, of course, they all did. All of them, even the ones whose names fill history books. They squatted here too, side by side with men who died forgotten, because here, no titles matter. Only the pressure in your gut, the coolness of stone, the stillness of the water below. The man beside you shifts, coughs again. He finishes, stands, adjusts his tunic, and walks out without a word. You take his spot, and warmer now, and settle in. You try not to breathe too deeply. Try not to hear the squelch of sponge against flesh. Try not to think of who sat before you, or what they left behind. The walls are scratched with names, insults, drawings. One reads, "I came here and so did love." Another, "Death is cleaner than this place." You smile, just slightly. Because even here, humans try to be clever. Even here, they seek meaning. If you look up, there's a small hole in the ceiling, a kind of skylight, though no one calls it that. Through it you see a slice of blue. A cloud drifts past, indifferent, and that's the strange part. In this room where everything is exposed, where bodies slump and grunts escape without apology, there's a kind of peace, not pride, not dignity, but something quieter, a strange democracy, a shared silence. You remember once, years ago, when you came here with your father. He whispered a joke about noblemen having noble bowel movements. You laughed too loud and were shushed, but he smiled. You remember that smile more than the words. Now it's your turn to finish. You reach for the sponge, it's cold, wet. You do what needs doing, then you rinse it in the running water and place it back for the next soul brave enough to sit. There's no soap, just a stone basin near the exit with water. So still it reflects your face. You wash your hands slowly. Carefully, you watch the dirt swirl away. It doesn't all leave. You dry them on your tunic. That's what it's for, really, a body's burden, a towel, a disguise. Outside, the world feels louder, brighter, like the latrine was a pause, unpleasant, but stillness all the same. You rejoin the street, the clamor, the smells of food that only some will eat, and no one knows where you've just been. Or maybe they do, but no one says it. That's part of the deal, the dignity of not mentioning, but you carry the feeling with you. The strange humility of a place where emperors and slaves once sat inches apart, staring at the same stones, breathing the same sour air. It reminds you that no matter how high someone builds their villa, the body still calls, and the ground still waits. Later, as you sit on a stoop nibbling what passes for lunch, a crust of fig if you're lucky, you think of that little skylight again. The way the light pierced even the filth. It's a reminder that even in places no one wants to be remembered, the sky still looks in quietly without judgment. He didn't look like a hero. There was no gleaming armor, no flowing cape, no wind lifting his cloak in a noble pose. Just dust. Thick, pale, patient dust, clinging to his sandals, drying the cracks in his hands, lining his throat like a second silence. He was a Roman soldier, but not the kind carved into stone, not the kind painted on pottery or raised in toast by trembling senators. He was the kind that waited, marched, itched, bled from blisters, not battle. His name didn't matter. None of them did, really. Not out here. They were called by numbers, orders, curses, or nothing at all. And when he woke, stiff and sore beneath a canvas flap staked crooked against the wind, his first thought wasn't glory. It was bread. And how cold his knees were. The camp wasn't quiet. It never was. There was always a cough, a clatter, a whispered complaint. The kind of noise made by men too tired to pretend they weren't suffering. He sat up slowly, shaking straw from his tunic. His blanket had slid off in the night, and no one had fixed it. That's how it was. You learned to hold your warmth like a secret. The boots went on stiff. Dust had crusted the laces. He didn't bother shaking them out. Whatever was inside, dirt, ants, a pebble or two, it would just join the rest of the day. Outside the light was thin. Morning, but barely. The sky hadn't made up its mind yet. Grayish, muted, like a bruise that never healed. Someone was boiling water in a dented pot. Not for tea, just for warmth. He cupped a bit in his hands and rubbed it over his face. It helped. A little. No one spoke much at first. The men stretched, yawned, adjusted straps, checked weapons. Not in preparation for battle, just out of habit. You didn't wait for danger, it waited for you. Breakfast was hard tack. A chunk of something that used to be bread, dry as chalk. He chewed until his jaw ached and swallowed without tasting. It then came the march. The road stretched like an endless thread, tight, thin, merciless. Stones underfoot, wind at the sides, sun above when it chose to appear. But most days, it didn't. You walked because they told you to. That was the job. Miles passed in silence, boots scraping, shoulders swaying. And when you stopped, your legs forgot how to be still. Some men joked, some didn't. He stayed quiet. He saved his breath for the weight of the shield, the rub of the belt, the press of the helmet that sat crooked on his skull. There were no battles this week, maybe not this month, just walking, guarding things that didn't seem worth guarding, outposts, roads, silence itself. Sometimes they passed villages. People stared, but rarely with awe, more often with suspicion or boredom. Soldiers were everywhere, which meant they were nothing. He saw children throw stones once, missed entirely. Still, the message was clear. They stopped near a stream, not because it was beautiful, but because it was water. He knelt, splashed his face, let the cold sting his eyes. A frog darted past. He didn't react. You couldn't afford wonder out here. One of the men had a blister that burst. Blood soaked through his sandal. He limped without complaint. A medic. I gave him a cloth and a nod. That was medicine. That was care. By dusk, they set up camp again. Same layout, same ropes, same weary jokes. He sat by the fire without speaking, watched it crackle and spit. Let the heat creep into his bones like a forgotten kindness. Someone passed him wine. Thin, sour, but better than nothing. He sipped, then stared into the flames, tracing the shape of his own hand in the flicker. That's when he thought of home. Or what passed for it. A village, a sister who braided her hair tight. A mother who mended things, then scolded him for ruining them again. He hadn't seen them in years. He probably wouldn't for many more, if ever. But in the glow of the fire, with the dust of another long day curling around his feet, he let the memory sit beside him, quietly, like a friend who doesn't need to speak. Later, beneath the stars, if they were visible, he lay flat on the hard ground staring up, wondering what the stars saw, if they cared, if they remembered the names of the men whose graves would never be marked. He didn't ask for more than a dry night, maybe a dream that didn't ache, maybe a tomorrow that didn't start with sore ankles. The Empire called him a defender, a son of Mars, a builder of peace through strength. But all he wanted was socks without holes, a blanket that stayed, and boots that didn't whisper pain with every step. He was a Roman soldier, not a statue, not a hero, just a man with dust on his boots and silence in his chest. Winter didn't knock in Rome. It slipped in, sideways, quiet, unwanted, through the cracks in the roof, beneath the doors that never shut properly, along the seams of blankets, long past their usefulness, and once it arrived, it stayed. Not with violence, but with persistence. They didn't have fireplaces. Not the poor. Not the ones tucked into the sloping hillsides, behind the markets beneath the shadow of the walls. They had braziers if they were lucky, or just breath and body heat, shared like food, like gossip, like prayers. In one such hut, a family curled together, 3, maybe 4 bodies under one woolen sheet, stiff with age and ash. The child at the center kicked in his sleep. His toes were blue around the edges. No one moved to cover them. The blanket didn't reach. The fire had gone out. Hours ago. Not from neglect or from economy. Wood was expensive, smoke stained the ceiling. But most of all, fire burned fast. Too fast for nights this long. The mother lay with her back to the wind. She had stuffed rags in the cracks along the wall earlier. They shifted in the night. Cold fingers poked through. She tightened her shawl. Thought of warmer places. She had none. The father stirred. Not awake, not exactly. Just drifting between discomforts. One in his shoulder, one in his hip, one in the silence of his stomach. There was a pot near the hearth. It held nothing now. Earlier it had held something like soup, water, lentils, maybe onion skin. He had stirred it slowly, hoping the sound would comfort the children. It hadn't. But he'd stirred anyway. Now the pot was cold, and so was the room. Everything was cold, tuned the walls, the mats, the air, even the dreams. He sat up eventually, rubbing his hands together. Breath clouded in front of his face like a ghost refusing to leave. He cupped his hands over his mouth, trying to trap the warmth. It vanished anyway. A rat scurried along the far wall. He didn't chase it. Let it have whatever crumbs it could. Find hunger makes neighbors of strange things. The child stirred again, this time with a whimper. The father lay back down, pulled the child closer, let the boy's legs drape over his own. It helped. A little. Outside, frost grew along the edge of the doorway, white lace on weathered wood. The moon was out, but no one saw it. No one cared. Moonlight didn't warm. The blanket shifted again. A hole near the middle caught a draft and funneled it inward. The mother didn't flinch. She was used to cold finding its way in. The body adapts. Sort of. In the corner, an old woman, the mother's mother, lay with her eyes open. She couldn't sleep anymore, not deeply, not since her bones began to hum with ache. She stared at the wall, at a patch of shadow shaped like a bird. It moved when someone breathed. She pretended it was real. When she was a child, winters meant snow in the hills. White, clean, pretty even. Now it meant stillness. Too much stillness. Like the kind that comes before death. She closed her eyes again. Not to sleep. Just to stop seeing. If warmth came, it would come in the form of another body. A neighbor. A cousin. Someone who'd knocked and asked to share the night. But no one knocked. Not tonight. The cold kept even desperation indoors. A log, if they had one, would have been split hours ago, but they didn't. Not this year. The woodcutter had raised prices, said the forest was farther now, said his mule was lame. Everyone had reasons. The father drifted into sleep, the kind that doesn't rest, just floats. His last thought was of a fire that burned too fast, and a loaf of bread too hot to touch. He smiled, barely, then forgot. The child dreamed of warmth, of laying in the sun on stones that baked all morning. He turned onto his side. The blanket slipped again. But this time, the mother tugged it back, covered him fully. Let her own feet go bare. In a town like this, winter didn't kill loudly. It crept, took things slowly, first the toes, then the laughter, then the appetite. By the time spring came, you couldn't remember what it had taken, but still they survived. Not because they were strong, because they knew how to share. Heat, bread, silence. That night in that hut, no one spoke. There were no songs, no stories, just the soft rustling of cloth and the breath of 4 people trying to remember what warmth felt like. And somehow, against every odd, they made it to morning. The city didn't wake. It stirred, like a beast that never truly slept. Even before the light touched the rooftops, the noise began. Not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily, like a drum with no hand striking it. A wheel turned on stone. A gate creaked open. A dog barked without reason, then kept barking because no one stopped it. A woman called out, voice raspy from the cold. Somewhere, a baby added. Hats protest to the morning chorus. This was the Roman street, not in triumph, not in ceremony, but in motion. Constant, reluctant, relentless. You lived close to it. Too close. The window let in every sound and very little light. You tied a strip of cloth over your hair, rubbed your eyes, and stepped outside with your shoulder already aching. The cobbles were wet, though it hadn't rained. Urine, mostly. Water from tilted buckets. Grease from yesterday's food stall. Things better left unnamed vendors were setting up. Cloths pulled tight over crooked tables. Wooden trays stacked with figs and garlic, beans and barley. Meat that shouldn't still be sold but would be anyway. A man sharpened a knife on a leather strap, spitting to wet the stone. He didn't say hello. No one really did. The noise wasn't just loud. It was layered. Laughter beside coughing, arguing over coin, clapping from children who'd tied rags around their feet and played at being chariot drivers, dragging each other through puddles as if they were made of gold. You passed, by them with a half smile. They didn't notice. Joy came easier to them, sorry for now. A cart nearly clipped your hip. The driver cursed you for being in the way. You didn't respond. Not out of fear, out of routine. The street belonged to whoever shouted loudest. And this morning, your voice hadn't yet woken up. A beggar reached for your sleeve. You had nothing to give, not today. You mumbled a prayer, not for him, but for the guilt, and walked on. The sun rose slowly, melting only the thinnest crusts of frost. The deeper cold stayed trapped in the stones, in the walls, in the people. Noise pressed in from all sides, yet somehow inside you there was numbness. Not peace, just space where feeling used to be. It helped, it had to. At the butcher's stall, flies outnumbered the meat. A leg of something dangled from a hook. You couldn't afford it. Even if you could, you'd think twice. Someone shouted. A pot clanged, a woman slipped. No one helped, but no one laughed either. The street wasn't cruel. It just didn't have time. A man with no sandals padded past, feet wrapped in linen. He was talking to himself, hands moving like he was telling a story no one had asked for. You watched him for a moment, wondered if he used to be different. The baker's stall had warmth, real warmth, the kind that came with the smell of bread and fire. You paused near it, pretended to count your coins. You had 3. Not enough for anything whole, but maybe for a heel. Maybe even a smile if the baker felt kind. He didn't. Not today. You moved on. Past the cloth merchants, the fish sellers, the man with jars of sour wine. Past a boy crying and a girl stealing and an old man cleaning his teeth with a twig, like it was a sword he once used in war. The noise wrapped around you like a coat with no lining, heavy but not helpful. You saw a man sweeping. His broom was nearly worn to the handle. He didn't sweep filth. He rearranged it. That was all any of you did, really. There was singing somewhere. A woman's voice, high and thin, barely heard over the din. It came from a window, or maybe a rooftop. You followed it for a few steps, but it disappeared, drowned by the clatter of pots and the shriek of a rooster confused about the hour. You reached the fountain, not a grand one, just a cracked basin with moss at the edges and a trickle of water that sang louder than it should. You cupped your hands and drank. It was cold, it tasted of tin, but it was yours for a moment. A child beside you stared. You let her drink next. She nodded, solemn and silent. Her cheeks were pink from the wind. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve and vanished into the crowd. The day thickened. Heat rose. The scent changed. Less smoke, more sweat. The crowd pressed tighter. Arguments got shorter. Patience wore thin. And still the street buzzed. You felt it in your bones, the numb hum of survival. Not urgent, just endless. By mid-afternoon, your feet were tired, your tunic pulled tight against the wind. You'd done nothing heroic. You'd earned no coin. You'd spoken to no one who remembered your name, but you were still upright, still moving. That counted. The noise had dulled. Not because it stopped, but because you stopped hearing it. It became background, like the ache in your knees, like the hunger. And in that silence, in that numbness, you remembered something strange. That life in Rome wasn't quiet or clean, or kind, but it was shared. It wrapped itself around every person in the crowd, the seller, the thief, the soldier, the girl. It hummed inside them all, a single pulsing survival. And somehow that noise, for all its sharpness and stench, meant you were still here, still part of something, still Roman. They say a slave has no name, but that's not quite true. You had one once. Maybe it was shouted when you were born. Maybe it was whispered into your ear by a mother who couldn't keep you. Now, though, you answer to whatever they call you. Boy, girl, you. That one. Faster. The sun rises before you do. Or maybe it doesn't. You're not sure. You never see it from where you sleep. Curled in a storeroom behind the kitchen, beside sacks of barley and jars of oil. You don't dream. There's no time for that. You rise when the floor begins to move, footsteps above you, voices sharpening, the day sliding open like a blade. You sit up, pull your tunic over your head, and begin. The first job is fire. It always is. You kneel, at the hearth, coaxing last night's ash into something warm enough to boil water. You don't speak, you cough once. The smoke answers. Then bread. Then water. Then sweeping. Someone yells for a cup. Someone else needs help with their sandals. The master's son wants his cloak, and he wants it now. You hurry. Always hurry. But never too fast. Too fast draws suspicion. Too slow draws worse. The day rolls forward like a wheel over your back. You clean. You pour. You nod. You disappear when not needed. Reappear when guessed at. You live in the spaces between commands. The kitchen smells of vinegar, and it always does. Not the good kind, the sharp, bitter kind used to wash things clean. You carry a pot outside to dump. It sloshes and splashes on your feet. You don't. Flinch. You've learned not to react to cold, or pain, or the sting of sour water. At noon you don't eat with them. You eat after, if there's anything left. Often just a crust, or the soft inside of a fruit someone found too bruised to finish. You sit on a stone step for those few minutes, not because it's comfortable, because it's yours. 5 minutes of not being seen, 5 minutes where no one calls your name, or whatever they use instead of it. Sometimes another slave joins you. You don't talk, but you sit close, shared. Silence is safer than spoken comfort. Then the work begins again, washing feet, sweeping rooms where no one walks, folding linens no one notices, listening to jokes that aren't funny, laughing anyway. In the afternoon, the lady of the house asks for music. You don't play an instrument, but you know how to hum. So you do. She doesn't listen. That's not why she asked. Later, you're sent to the market. They trust you not to run. Not because you wouldn't, but because where would you go? You have no coin, no name. You'd be caught before the sun touched the rooftops. So you walk through the stalls with your head low, repeating the list in your head: lentils, oil, fish. The merchant eyes you closely. You don't meet his gaze, he smirks. You've seen that smirk before, it doesn't mean anything kind. You return with everything except the fish. The smell was wrong, the eyes cloudy. You know what happens if you bring back bad fish. Back at the house you deliver the goods, nod once and slip back into the walls. No one says thank you. Evening comes slowly. The light dims like breath fading. The lamps are lit, not by magic, but by you. You trim the wicks, strike the flint, breathe life into flame again and again. Someone complains about the wine. You fetch a different cup. Someone drops a fig. You clean it. Someone laughs too loudly and your body tenses. Just in case. You don't speak unless asked. You don't look unless told. You don't rest unless the house sleeps. When the last door clicks shut and the laughter finally dies, you return to the storeroom. Your bed is a blanket folded in half. It smells of old grain and damp stone. You lie down. Sometimes you remember your real name, not out loud, just in the space behind your eyes. It sits there, quiet and stubborn, like a coal that hasn't gone cold. You wonder what it would sound like if someone said it gently. Not as a command, not as a threat, just gently. Your hands are sore. There's a cut on your thumb from the wine jug. You suck on it. The blood tastes like iron and salt, like truth. In the dark, you hear someone crying in the next room. Another slave. You don't ask who. It doesn't matter. It could have been you. It might still be. Tomorrow will be the same. Maybe colder, maybe not. But always the same shape. You don't hope for freedom. Not really. Hope is dangerous. Hope makes hands shake. Hope makes you pause when you should run. Instead, you survive. You memorize footsteps. You count coins you never hold. You remember which faces mean harm and which ones just forget you exist. You learn how to vanish in full view. You sleep without dreams, because dreams ask questions, and you have no answers. The walls were thinner than secrets, made of brick, plaster, and prayers. Not strong prayers either. The kind muttered while shivering, half believed but still repeated, just in case. You didn't live alone. No one did, not here. There was barely enough room for one family, and yet 4 crammed themselves in, one in each corner, like they were playing some strange game of survival. The tenement leaned, not much, but enough that you could feel it when you sat too close to the wall, a gentle tilt, a sigh in stone, like even the building was tired, of standing. The stairs creaked in protest whenever someone climbed. The boards had stories etched into them by sandaled feet and spilled soup. You knew which step groaned the loudest and which one could be skipped entirely. You lived on the third floor, or what passed for it, a climb that stole your breath every time but gave it back slowly in the comfort of the familiar. There was one window, fogged with years of breath and grease. It didn't open, not really, but sometimes in late spring, if you pushed just right, it let in a sliver of air that smelled faintly of bread or someone else's fire. You had your space, a corner by the wall, marked with a basket, a mat, and an old clay cup that wasn't chipped until last week. You told yourself it still worked, and it did, just a little less beautifully. Noise was constant. Coughs, murmurs, the scratch of fingernails on wool, babies crying in shifts like they'd agreed on a schedule. But within the noise there was warmth. Not always, but sometimes. A neighbor shared lentils when yours burned. Someone mended your sleeve with thread too bright for your tunic. A child handed you half a fig, sticky fingers and all, and asked for nothing in return. Tiny triumphs, too small to brag about, too important to forget. You didn't own a chair, but someone let you borrow one when your mother's knees gave out. She sat on it like a queen, spooning broth into her mouth as though it were gold. She smiled that night. The chair didn't fix her, but it made her feel seen. There was a shelf above your mat. It held one cracked bowl, a sliver of soap, a folded cloth, and a carved figurine you found by the river. No one knew what it was meant to be, a goddess maybe, or just a child's lost toy. But it stood upright, and that felt symbolic. Rain came through the roof sometimes, not always where you expected. A drip near the pot, a drip on the blanket. You shifted accordingly. That was the rhythm of life here. Shift, adjust, survive. Once a mouse built a nest in the corner. You didn't chase it out. You watched it for days until it left on its own. You missed it more than you expected. At night, everyone slept, in rows, a patchwork of bodies and breaths. The air turned sweet with fatigue. Even the snores seemed coordinated, a strange lullaby of exhaustion. When someone coughed too hard, a hand reached in the dark. A cloth was passed. Water was fetched. Not because anyone was noble, but because no one wanted to be next. One evening, the old woman across from you lit a candle. Just one. She set it in a broken bowl and hummed something. A lullaby from her childhood, perhaps, or a prayer to someone she'd forgotten how to name. The glow was soft. It made the walls look like gold for a few minutes. Everyone watched without watching. No one spoke. That was the kind of night you remembered. Not because of the candle, but because no one argued, no one cried. The silence didn't ache. It rested. Mornings were cold and rushed. Elbows bumped, tempers flared. But most days someone smiled. Even if it was tired, even if it was crooked, it counted. You learned how to step over sleeping bodies, how to cook on half a flame, how to listen without interrupting. You learned how to say "I'm sorry" without using words, and how to accept help without shame. That's what the tenement taught you. Not how to rise, but how to remain, how to hold your place in a crumbling room without breaking it further. It wasn't a palace. It wasn't even dry, but it held you. And sometimes it held laughter, which in a city like Rome was rarer than marble. It came with such ceremony, arches cut through hills, stone teeth biting into the sky, aqueducts, proud, clever, towering things. Rome brought water from the mountains, they said, bent rivers to her will, made the dry world drink. But down where you lived, water didn't obey. You'd wake and listen, not to birds or bells, but to the creak of the spout. Sometimes it trickled. Other times it gurgled like a child with a secret. And then on the worst days, and nothing, silence, dry air, dust where the drip should be, you couldn't fight it. You couldn't fix it. The aqueducts were for everyone, yes, but not equally. The rich had cisterns and fountains. The poor had hope and buckets. You'd carry yours every morning. Clay, cracked, heavy even when empty. Down 2 flights of stairs, past the neighbor with the limp and the boy with the runny nose, and into the street already warmed by too many feet. The fountain was nearby, if it flowed. If it didn't, you walked farther. And farther still. Once, nearly to the edge of the city, chasing water like it owed you something. But it never did. Water didn't care. It flowed where the stones were cleanest, where the coins were brightest, where senators bathed their dogs and mistresses washed their feet. You saw it once, a girl giggling as she splashed scented water on her arms. You carried yours home in silence. You had no cent to waste. Some days the water turned white. Lime, they said. Harmless, they said, but your stomach knew better. You drank it anyway. The body doesn't wait for purity, only wetness. When the jug was full, you carried it like a child, and it close, careful, tense. It sloshed against your side, cold at first, then warm from your skin. Sometimes it leaked, sometimes it broke. Once you dropped it on the stairs. It cracked in two. The water fled across the stone like it was running for freedom. You watched it go, then cried. Not for the jug, not really, but for the waste, the effort, the start-againness of it all. You used a bowl after that, smaller, less noble, but it held. Bathing was a luxury. You'd scoop water into a basin, wash one limb at a time, start with the face, end with the feet. No soap, just hands and hope. Clothes were rinsed in the same basin, then hung from nails by the window. When the wind blew right, they smelled of sky. When it didn't, they smelled of damp stone and effort. You cleaned the floor once a week, not because it stayed clean, but because doing so felt like control. A small rebellion. A way of saying, I matter, my dust doesn't own me. Children fetched water too. Tiny hands gripping giant jars. They laughed when they spilled it, until they didn't, until someone shouted, until the jar was the only one left in the house, and now it had a crack, and you'd patch it, with wax, with twine, with faith. Because you had no choice. There was a man who said the aqueducts were miracles, that Rome had conquered thirst, but that man lived uphill. His fountain never dried. You passed it once, touched it, cold, clear, endless. You cupped your hands under it, not to drink, to feel, like a ghost touching a god. At home, the water tasted of clay, of time, of the jug itself, sometimes of iron, sometimes of moss. But you drank it. You had to. Every day, and when you were sick, the water was both cure and curse. You boiled it, strained it through cloth, prayed over it. It worked, or it didn't. But you believed in it, because water was truth. It didn't flatter, didn't beg. It flowed. Or it didn't. It stayed, or it vanished. Like luck, like friends, like health. On rare days, rain. Blessed, leaking, laughing rain. It poured from rooftops, filled buckets, spilled down alleys. You ran barefoot with your mouth open, caught drops on your tongue, tilted pots to the sky. Neighbors leaned from windows and smiled at nothing. Just the sound, just the joy of it. No payment required, no permissions granted. You scrubbed clothes in it, hair, hands. For once you didn't ration. You danced in the puddles until someone slipped, and even then, you laughed. Then it ended, as all things do, and the bucket sat full for a day, then half full, then dry again, and the fountain returned to its moods. The jug waited by the door, like always. You carried it again, and again, because even when water didn't care, you still did. They say find your calling. But in Rome, most people found only their orders. You didn't choose your trade, it chose you. Handed down like a chipped bowl or an old scar, something inherited, not earned. Maybe your father salted fish. Maybe your mother mended tunics. Maybe you were born into clay or iron or soot. But by the time you could speak, your hands already knew the motions. Work wasn't identity. It was endurance. You woke each morning not to ambition, but to necessity, the kind that gnawed before. You even opened your eyes. Your body already saw, your back already bracing. The day had demands before you'd even stood. You tied your belt tight, not for dignity but for pressure. It helped keep the hunger still, and then, like the rest, you stepped out into the work, the waiting, the doing. There were jobs, yes, too many of them. Bricklayers and rat catchers. Dyers, bakers, sweepers, haulers. You knew a man who cleaned latrines with a stick and a prayer, another who boiled leather so foul it burned your nose for hours after. You? You carried things. That was your place. Not glamorous, not shameful. Just heavy. Sacks of flour, buckets of sand, crates of dates already rotting at the edges. You knew how to stack without shifting, how to brace without breaking. It was a dance with gravity, and some days it won. The market was your route. The chati, alley your stage. People passed you without seeing, unless you dropped something and then they stared, not with malice but with curiosity, as if wondering whether you'd stand up again. You always did, or someone helped. Sometimes. At noon, you paused in a corner, one knee bent, one hand on your ribs, not resting, calculating. How many loads left, how much strength still hiding in your thighs? Lunch, if it happened, was silent. A crust in the shadow of a pillar, a sip of water that tasted like yesterday. You chewed slowly, not for enjoyment, but to make it last. You didn't hate the work, not really. It gave shape to the day, a beginning, a middle, an end. That was something. And there were small wins. A nod from a merchant. A coin slipped into your hand without a word. A child who said thank you. Even a good rope felt like grace. Strong, smooth, wrapped just right around your wrist. But the fatigue. It was the kind that settled into your bones like dust. Shook loose only in sleep. And not always then. You saw others with different trades. A seamstress with swollen fingers, muttering curses into thread. A lamp maker with blackened nails. A pot seller shouting himself hoarse. No one smiled, not during work. Smiles came later, if there was bread. You thought once about changing trades, something easier, something quieter. But where would you go? Who would teach you? Who would wait for you to learn? Work didn't wait. It wasn't patient. It didn't care about dreams. You met a man once who'd been a singer. Had a voice like honey, he said. Now he shoveled ash. His songs were gone, but his hands were strong. That's what mattered. By late afternoon, the city slumped. Even the air felt tired. Vendors rested on crates. Guards leaned on spears. You leaned on nothing. Standing made it easier to move when called. And still, the work came. The loads, the lifting, the sweat that soaked through your tunic and left your spine slick. No applause. No praise, just nods, grunts, maybe a coin, maybe not. But you went on because the body could bear more than the mind believed. And because not working meant not eating. Not eating meant not standing. And standing was all you had. Evening changed. The pace, but not the weight. You carried until the sun dipped, and then a little longer. You worked by lamplight when you had to. Shadows didn't lift things, but they watched. At night your hands tingled. Your knuckles cracked. Your feet throbbed like hearts with no rhythm. You sat on the edge of your mat, looked at your palms, and saw nothing but lines. Some called them lifelines. You called them maps. Of what you'd carried, of what you'd dropped, of what you'd survived. And in that stillness, sore, hungry, half asleep, you whispered to yourself, I worked, I lived, I'm here. Not because it was noble, but because it was true. It began with shouting. Not angry shouting, just the kind people used when they were trying to sell you something before you even knew you wanted it. Bread, fresh as morning, spices, rare and real, fish, still blinking. You didn't believe any of them. But you walked, faster anyway. That was the pull of the market. Noise before color, smell before truth. It tugged at your senses whether you had coin or not. The street narrowed as you approached. Cloth hung between stalls like tired flags. Stone beneath your feet slick with oil, fruit skins, water from pots that no one had refilled in days. You ducked under an awning. The scent changed with every step. Cinnamon, then meat, then smoke, then sweat. Someone laughed too loudly, someone else shouted at a goat. The market had its own rhythm, and you learned to move with it. You passed figs so soft they looked like bruises with stems, dates in piles that glistened like secrets. A woman with 2 teeth and a dozen reasons why her lemons were better than anyone else's. She offered you one. You shook your head. She shrugged, not offended, just part of the game. Next came the cloth. Too bright for your life, but beautiful all the same. You ran a finger along a bolt of blue linen and imagined just for a second what it would feel like on your shoulders. Someone bumped into you. You said sorry. They didn't. The jostling never ended, but it never felt cruel. It was just the price of being there. At a stall with broken bowls, you paused. You needed one. Yours cracked last week. You held one up to the light, chipped, but whole enough. The man behind the table raised 2 fingers. You showed him one, he smiled. You paid 2, that's how it worked. The fish sellers were shouting again, always shouting, slapping scales, gutting with theatrical flair. You avoided eye contact. That smell stayed on you all day. A boy ran past with a plum in his fist and guilt on his face. Behind him, a woman screamed curses that were too old to sting. No one chased. The market made thieves and forgivers. You passed a stall with combs carved from bone. The woman selling them had hands too smooth for her trade. You didn't ask. She didn't offer. You just touched the comb. Cool, lovely, and moved on. A musician played a reed pipe in the corner, badly but with heart. A few coins glittered in his cup. A dog slept beside him, ears twitching to a tune it didn't care for. You bought bread. Half a loaf, warm at the center. The vendor winked. You didn't know why. Maybe he mistook you for someone else. Or maybe he liked your face. Or maybe it was just habit. You tore the bread with your fingers, ate it in 3 bites. It filled your mouth, if not your stomach. Still, it was good. Chewy, honest. Someone offered wine from a jug wrapped in reeds. You declined. The last time you accepted, you didn't walk straight for a day, and the hangover had nothing poetic about it. You watched a child try to balance 3 apples in her arms. She dropped one. A stranger picked it up, brushed it off, and gave it back. Neither of them smiled. But something kind passed between them anyway. In the middle of the market stood a man selling nothing, just standing, watching, his arms folded, his eyes sharp. You wondered if he was waiting for someone, or watching for thieves, or simply lonely. You avoided him too. The sun climbed. Heat turned the market into a slow boil. Tempers thinned. Voices rose. A man swore he'd been cheated. A woman slapped his hand. A crowd gathered not to help, just to witness. The argument fizzled. The crowd scattered like dry leaves. No one cared that much. You bought onions. 3 small ones they clinked against each other in the pouch at your side. A scent like promise you'd fry them tonight or boil them, or just stare at them and imagine better meals. A man offered charms, wood carved into animals, gods, symbols. You touched one shaped like a bird. He said it brought luck. You didn't believe him, but your fingers lingered. You didn't buy it, but you remembered its shape. As the afternoon wore on, the market sagged. Sellers sat. Buyers left. The colors dimmed. The fruit sweated. The bread went stale. The charm man packed his birds. You stayed until the end, watching, listening, letting the crowd fade from chaos into silence. Then you walked home, bread in your belly, onions in your bag, a chipped bowl under your arm, dust on your toes, the noise still humming faintly in your ears. The market had given you little, but it had given, and in Rome, that counted for more than most things. They rarely appeared in stone, not unless they were mothers of emperors or wives of men who mattered. Even then their names came last, after titles, after bloodlines, after wars. But in the homes, in the streets, in the hush between footsteps, Roman women were everywhere, and they were listening. Their silence wasn't absence. It was armor. She rose before the sun, always. Her breath puffed into the cold, like a whisper, from a dream not yet finished. She wrapped herself in cloth that smelled of ash and thyme, then tiptoed across the floorboards, careful not to wake the baby, the dog, the silence. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say yet. Water was fetched. Bread was warmed, a poultice prepared for someone's cough. She moved with purpose, not noise, like a shadow that knew its own weight. In the street, men shouted over grain, argued over coins, spoke of laws and storms and the rising cost of oil. She walked past them with her eyes down and her ears wide open. Every word mattered, even the careless ones. At the well, she waited her turn. There was always a line, buckets, arms, weary glances. A few women chatted softly about bruised fruit, a neighbor's baby, a stain that wouldn't come out. She smiled once, just to remind her. Face that it could. Back home the pot boiled. She stirred it with the grace of someone who knew every bubble by name. The smell filled the small space. Something with lentils, maybe garlic. Not much, but enough. Her husband groaned in the other room. She didn't answer, not out of disrespect, but because nothing needed saying. His body was tired, so was hers. She brought him the bowl, set it beside him, and let him eat in peace. She didn't sit. Later she mended a tunic. The stitches were uneven but strong. She worked in a rhythm, in, pull, not, breathe. A child leaned against her leg and slept. She didn't move, not until the needle was back in the basket. She had once dreamed of teaching, of scribbling letters on a wax tablet and hearing them spoken back. Now she taught with gestures, where to stand, how to fold, when to speak. It was enough. She wasn't educated, not by scrolls or tutors, but she knew the language of looks, of the way someone placed a cup, of how tightly someone tied their belt. She read people the way others read poetry. She visited a neighbor who had just given birth. No grand declarations, just a basin, a cloth, a steady hand. She bathed the baby without comment, then held the mother's hand in silence. It was the kindest sentence she never said. Her day continued in fragments, wiping, heating, folding, standing still long enough for the ache to settle and then vanish again. She didn't complain. She didn't sigh. But sometimes late in the day when no one watched, she hummed. A melody with no words, just sound. Gentle, broken, familiar. Once, when she was younger, a man told her she was well behaved. She smiled then too, but it was a different kind of smile. One that knew he had no idea what it cost her to stay quiet. She had opinions. Plenty. About the neighbors, about the empire, about how barley cooked too fast when the pot was old, but she saved them, let them simmer. And when night fell and the children were wrapped in sleep and the fire was down to orange whispers, she sat alone for the first time all day. No one asked her what she thought, but if they had, she would have had answers. She would have told them that silence isn't weakness, that tending a room teaches you more than standing in a senate, that watching teaches more than speaking. That love, when folded into linen and carried in calloused hands, lasts longer than speeches. She would have told them that history forgot the wrong people. And when the lamp flickered and the street fell quiet and the last dish was stacked beside the others, she breathed out, not a word, just a long, just slow breath, and let herself rest. Tomorrow she'd rise before the sun again, not for glory, not for thanks, just because someone must, and the empire would march, and the markets would open, and the men would talk. But none of it would hold, together without women like her, quiet, constant, unrecorded. It clung to everything, not because people were lazy, not because they didn't care, but because in Rome filth was as constant as the sun, and sometimes just as necessary. It lived in corners, in cracks, in folds of fabric too worn to be washed again. It hung in the air, softened by smoke, curled under fingernails, pressed itself into floorboards and hearts alike. Cleanliness was a luxury, not a virtue, not a habit, a luxury. Something the rich purchased with soap, servants, fresh linens and scented oils. But for everyone else, filth had a function. You didn't scrub your walls. The soot helped keep the cold out. You didn't toss your cloak in the basin after every wear. The layer of grime made it warmer. Heavier, yes, but comforting in its way. The floor of your tenement room hadn't been swept in days. You meant to. You always meant to. But by the time the bread was made and the water fetched and the ache slowed to something manageable, the dirt didn't feel so urgent, and so it stayed, gathered in the corners like dust-colored moss. Not beautiful, but soft, familiar. Children played in it, drew shapes with sticks, laughed through coughs that never quite left their chests. You worried, but you didn't stop them. What else was there? The mattress, if you called it that, smelled of sweat and straw and something older. But it was warm, or warm enough. And warmth mattered more than pride. You once slept in a room that had been scrubbed white, a cousin's wedding or maybe a temple visit. The walls glared, the air echoed. You couldn't sleep that night, too clean, too hollow. Back home, the Grime greeted you like a friend. It wrapped you in scent and soot and familiarity. It reminded you where you belonged. In the market, you saw a woman with spotless hands, pale, soft, unused. She bought onions with a glove on. You wondered how she peeled them, if she even knew how. Your own hands were stories, blisters and cuts and earth under the nails. No one complimented them, but they fed people, they carried warmth. They were honest. Bathing was occasional, strategic. Cold water in a cracked bowl warmed by your breath more than the sun. You did what you could. Neck, arms, feet. The rest would wait. It always did. Clothing was beaten clean when it needed to be, when the smell turned sharp or the stains began to tell secrets. Until then, you wore the dirt like a layer of skin. Visitors noticed. You could see it in their eyes. The pause, the polite nod. But they never said anything. Because they knew, or were learning, that in Rome survival didn't always smell good. You'd learned tricks. Burned herbs near the doorway, dabbed vinegar behind your ears. Let bread bake longer so the scent filled the room. These were small victories. And when it rained, truly rained, you stood under the eaves and let the water kiss your shoulders. You didn't call it bathing, but afterward you felt different, lighter, almost clean. Filth, in your world, wasn't just tolerated. It protected. It sealed the cracks in walls. It muffled the creaks of old stairs. It thickened the air so that warmth lingered longer. It wasn't pleasant, but it was yours. You cleaned when you could, when a neighbor visited, when someone was ill, when death came too close and the smell of life had to be renewed. You did not live in squalor. You lived in necessity, and within it you still found beauty, in a corner swept clear by a child's hand, in the glow of firelight bouncing off clay jars stained by use, in the feel of worn wool draped over skin still damp from a wash. Some said filth was failure, but you knew better. You saw it for what it was, the residue of doing what needed to be done. A tenement might not shine, but it held people, it sheltered stories, and sometimes, when the lamp burned low and the city quieted, just enough the dirt didn't feel like defeat, it felt like proof. Proof that you'd worked, that you'd stayed, that you hadn't vanished, because in the empire's polished halls no one left a mark. But here, in your small, grimy world, everything bore your fingerprint. And somehow, that felt like dignity. It started with a cough. Not a dramatic one, just the kind that slips out quietly between spoons of soup, dry, persistent, small enough to ignore. You didn't speak of illness, not unless you had to, not unless it interrupted the day so thoroughly that silence couldn't contain it anymore. Because being sick meant more than pain. It meant missed wages, missed meals, a danger not just to the body, but to the rhythm that held everything together. And so you hoped that it was just the cold, just the dust, just a moment of weakness. You sipped warm broth, sat near the fire, pulled your shawl tighter. But then came the fever, heat that didn't comfort. That pulsed behind the eyes, soaked the tunic, turned rest into restlessness. You curled into your mat and counted your breaths, as if numbers could carry you through. Someone brought herbs, crushed and steeped, bitter to the tongue. You drank anyway, not for the taste, for the belief. The room darkened early, not because the sun set, but because your eyes wouldn't hold it anymore. You stared at shadows, listened to your own heartbeat, waited for the trembling to stop, and the house continued. Children played. Someone cooked. Someone swept near the wall. Life didn't pause for your ache. It moved carefully around you like you were a puddle on the floor. No doctor came. That was for others. You had neighbors. A grandmother with knowledge older than reason. A cousin who remembered which leaves to boil. They came quietly, laid hands on your forehead, whispered things that sounded like comfort, though you couldn't hold on to the words. You slept, not peacefully, not fully, but in pieces, dreamed of warmth, then of falling, then of a room you didn't recognize, woke to darkness, to someone, wiping your face with a damp cloth, to the sound of your own name said softly, said like a goodbye or a prayer. You didn't know how many days passed. The lamp burned low, The broth went untouched. Voices became blurs. Light stung. Cold settled deeper. And in that silence you began to wonder if this was how it ended, not with drama, not with spectacle, but with a quiet fade, a small bed, a worn blanket, a hand in yours that didn't let go. You thought of the things you hadn't finished, a tunic left half mended, a pot you meant to scrub, a child who'd asked a question you never answered. You thought of your mother, of the day she didn't rise, of how someone covered her with a sheet and whispered, "Let her sleep." And now here you were, not afraid. Not exactly, but full of thoughts that wouldn't settle. You didn't cry. You were too tired. But you listened to the hush of the room, to the soft steps of someone boiling water, to the rustle of a robe being folded nearby. And then, one morning, just like that, you woke without the fever. It was gone. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just gone. Your hands still shook, your knees still trembled, but the air no longer pressed on your chest. You could swallow without pain. The light didn't burn. Someone wept when they saw you sit up, not because they'd lost you, but because somehow they hadn't. And that was Roman survival. Not miracles, not medicine, but care, presence, the stubborn refusal to let go. Not everyone was so lucky. You knew that. You remembered the boy 3 doors down, the one who coughed for weeks, then went still. His mother lit a candle, left it in the window. No one spoke of it, but everyone saw. Or the old man who stopped eating, who lay in the corner while people whispered nearby, who vanished one morning, and whose name was scratched quietly from the doorframe. Death in Rome wasn't loud. It came wrapped in cloth, carried on shoulders, mourned in silence. There was no procession, no speech, just a body, a cloth, a hole in the earth, and the ones who remained filled that hole with memory, with soup, with sweeping, with ordinary acts that refused to stop. You recovered. Slowly, you stood again, carried a cup, smiled though it hurt. You stepped into the street and squinted at the sun, surprised it still shone, unchanged. The world had gone on, and now, so would you. A little. Slower, a little softer, but still they didn't know they were Roman, not really, not yet. They didn't know about the Senate or the borders, or the men with scrolls who claimed the world as theirs. They knew stones, dust, string, laughter that echoed louder than sense, and joy that didn't ask permission. Children filled the corners of the empire, not in marble halls but in alleys under stairs, in the spaces between shop stalls and bread queues. They ran barefoot, not out of bravery. Just because shoes were rare and feet grew fast, you could hear them before you saw them. A high giggle, a sharp scream, the sound of 2 stones clacking together in a rhythm only they understood. Their games had no rules, or rather too many. A hop, a skip, a chant about a goose, a circle drawn in chalk, a dare to cross it, a line of pebbles, the palace, the guard, the thief. One kicked, one chased, one crowned. They made gods out of twigs, fortresses, from broken crates, gladiators from beetles. And every day they rewrote the rules. They didn't care that their tunics were patched, or that the bread they chewed had already been chewed once by time. They held crusts like treasures, shared grapes like secrets. Some had toys, a carved doll, a clay animal, a rattle made from a nutshell and a pebble, but most had imagination. And that was louder, brighter, faster than any shop could sell. They turned alleys into arenas, carts into chariots. You saw a boy once dragging a sack and calling it a lion. The others cheered, until someone fell, and then it was over. Until the next day they were loud in ways adults had forgotten how to be, until someone hissed from a window. Then they vanished, like smoke through a crack, only to return when the voice had faded. They didn't always laugh. Some days were harder. You'd see a girl sitting alone turning a pebble in her palm like it held answers, or a boy kicking dust at the wall because he'd been told no too many times in a row. They knew hunger. They knew fear. But somehow the world still seemed more game than sentence. You remembered being like that once, before work, before aches, before silence became safer than sound. The children in your building played a game with lids. They'd stack them, trade them, hide them under pots. You never understood the point. But they played for hours. A small one, 4, maybe 5, gave you a lid once, pressed it into your hand like a gift. It was bent and dull and perfect. You kept it. They taught each other everything. How to climb without falling, how to find figs where none should grow, how to steal without being cruel, how to stop crying before anyone noticed. You never heard them talk of dreams, but they lived, inside one in a way, where rocks became kingdoms and shadows became dragons. They didn't ask for space. They took it. A corner of the square, a patch by the fountain, a step outside your door, and you let them. Because watching them made the world feel possible. Again, they weren't clean, they weren't quiet. They were real, bright-eyed, dust-kneed, glorious. They got sick. They got better. They fell down. They stood. Sometimes they vanished. A fever, a fall, a silence no one filled. And the next day, the game began again. A little quieter, for a little while. One girl kept a bird's feather behind her ear. Said it helped her run faster. You believed her. One boy refused to speak unless someone called him emperor. He ruled the alley for a week before tripping into the laundry line and surrendering with grace. You saw them grow, saw their legs stretch, their games change, saw toys become tools, saw laughter become posture. But while it lasted, their world was lighter. And the stones they threw were never meant to hurt, just to bounce, to skip, to mark the rhythm of lives still unburdened by the empire's weight. They didn't know they were part of something vast. They didn't care. They only knew the here, the now. The small victories of finding a smoother stone, a louder laugh, a softer place to fall. The city changed when the sun went down. It didn't sleep. Not really. Rome was too restless, too large, too full of unfinished stories. But it shifted. The noise softened, the shadows lengthened. The streets began to whisper instead of shout. You could feel it in your spine before you saw it. The air cooled. The shutters closed. The scent of firewood replaced the sweat of the market. The vendors packed up first, their stalls folding like tired wings. Bread gone, fish wrapped. Coins clinked and counted in half-light. No one lingered. Not when the lamps burned low. By dusk, the corners filled with uncertainty. Not danger always, but the kind of quiet that made you walk faster, made you check twice, made you listen harder. You walked home carefully, your footsteps slower than during the day. Not because you had more time, but because the dark made each sound bigger. Someone coughed in an alley. A man stumbled into a doorway. A woman lit a candle behind a curtain and cast a silhouette more honest than her face had been all day. The stones underfoot were slick with the day's leftovers. Fruit pulp, mud, maybe worse. You stepped lightly. You carried your bundle close. The lamps were uneven. Some burned strong, others flickered. Some had gone out entirely, their oil spent, their wicks drowned. The shadows danced between them like thieves, silent, clever, uninvited. You passed a guard at the edge of the square. He didn't look up. Just leaned on his spear like he was resting against a tree in a dream he didn't want to be in. The taverns were louder now, their laughter more brittle, their songs more slurred. Inside, men clapped backs and spilled drink, pretending the dark. Outside didn't exist. You didn't go in. Someone argued near the bathhouse. You didn't stop, just turned your head slightly. Not to look, just to hear better. Because at night, everything mattered more. Every voice, every footfall, every flicker of light. The city wasn't louder. You were just listening harder. At the fountain, a boy sat on the edge, swinging his feet. Alone. Too late for a child. You didn't speak, just met his eye. He nodded, like an old man, then disappeared. You crossed the last alley, the one where the candle always burned low in the window. A woman's voice floated through it, humming a tune that sounded like lullabies and warnings all at once. At home, you slipped inside without knocking. No one locked doors, not because they felt safe, but because locks were a kind of wealth, too. Inside, the room glowed amber, not bright, but enough to see the contours of faces, the curve of bowls, the breath of sleep. Someone had saved food, a small plate. You nodded, ate in silence. The spoon felt heavy, like you were lifting the whole day with every bite. Outside, Rome kept breathing. You heard carts rattle past, slow, uncertain. Deliveries, maybe, or removals. You didn't ask. You didn't want to know. The city after sundown didn't answer questions. It just offered shadows and silence and dared you to find your way through both. You remembered once, years ago, getting lost after dark. A wrong turn. A street you didn't recognize. You walked in circles until your legs hurt, until you cried without sound. Then you saw a dog, thin, quiet. It walked ahead of you. You followed it home. You never saw it again. Now you made fewer wrong turns, not because the city had changed, but because you had. You moved with purpose, with instinct, with memory worn into your souls. A neighbor lit incense. The scent floated under your door. You closed your eyes and tried to name it. Lavender, sage, or just something meant to keep ghosts away. You sat by the window, not to see, but to feel. The breeze was thin. The stars blinked. Rome, in her arrogance, never dimmed enough to let the sky truly speak, but still, you watched. Because watching meant remembering you were alive. You thought of all the things the city held after dark: lovers whispering on rooftops, thieves slipping through cracks, widows crying behind curtains, guards falling asleep on their posts. You thought of the silence that wrapped them all together. Not peace exactly, but a kind of agreement that life was heavy, that night was long, that tomorrow would come, and it would be noisy again. Someone laughed down the street. Too loud, too sharp. You flinched, then relaxed. Just whine, just weariness. You stood, blew out the lamp. The room went soft. The city outside whispered one more time. Then, at last, rest. The temple stood tall, yes, stone columns, carved gods, incense thick as breath. But those weren't the only places prayers were whispered. Not in a city this full, not in a life this hard. Faith in Rome wasn't always grand. Sometimes it was improvised, folded into quiet corners, tucked behind oil jars, stitched into pockets beside a crust of bread. You had no priest, no scrolls. But you had a shelf, and on that shelf, a worn figurine, a small bowl for salt, and a cracked dish where you left bits of bread, sometimes fruit, sometimes just crumbs. You didn't know the name of the god, or maybe it was a goddess, but they'd been passed down the way grief is passed, silently, reverently, with eyes more than words. Your mother lit a candle for them once. You asked why. She said, "Because we still wake up." You kept the tradition. The gods of the rich lived in marble. Yours lived in clay, in walls that didn't collapse, in children who didn't cough too long, in the way the bread rose just enough to feed one more mouth. Some gods guarded doorways. You saw them in the homes of neighbors, painted figures, half-faded, standing beside dried herbs or carved sticks. Others sat in kitchens near the fire, not because they warmed themselves, but because they watched. One family swore by a statue of a chicken, another by a coin buried beneath their threshold. No one questioned it. You believed what worked. At the market you passed stalls with spices wrapped in parchment, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon that cost too much but still sold out, not just for cooking, but for burning, for offerings, for scenting the home so prayers might rise sweeter. You couldn't afford them. But once someone gave you a pouch of rosemary. You burned it slowly, one sprig at a time. The smoke curled like a sigh. You whispered into it, not for miracles, just for mercy. You visited temples when you had to, for weddings, for burials. The stone made your voice feel small. You bowed, you nodded. You placed your offering and left without lingering. But faith, the kind you lived with, was smaller. More honest. It didn't shout. It watched. In your neighbor's home, bones of ancestors sat in clay urns near the door. They weren't worshipped, just remembered, just included. The way you include salt in soup, not because it's seen, but because without it, something's missing. Children learned early to greet the little altar, to whisper thanks before meals, to tie a string around their wrist before traveling. Not for magic, for memory. The streets of Rome were filled with shrines, tiny, unnoticed by most. A carved face in the wall. A handful of coins tucked behind a statue. A flower pressed into the stone where someone once fell. You passed them without thinking, but sometimes you nodded, just in case. At night, you lit the lamp. Not just for light, but to show the gods you were still trying, still present. You said nothing aloud, but your silence was its own kind of offering. A man down the street worshipped a god from the east, with beads, with chants. Some mocked him. You didn't. He seemed calmer than most. Faith didn't need permission. In illness, you whispered names you weren't sure were divine. In hunger, you thanked a spirit when the bowl felt heavier than expected. In grief, you placed a piece of fruit beside the hearth and hoped the one who left could still smell it. Once you found a coin on the ground. You kept it, then changed your mind. You gave it to a child. He asked why. You said, "The gods like when we share." He nodded, like he understood something you hadn't said. On a cold morning when the fire wouldn't start, you knelt. Not out of desperation, but out of rhythm. You tapped the stone, whispered, waited. The fire lit on the third try. You didn't smile. You just said, "Thank you," and meant it. There were no hymns, no processions, just the quiet faith of those who couldn't afford to fail, the belief that something or someone might still be listening even when no one else was. You didn't ask for wealth. You asked for warmth, for safe journeys, for forgiveness, when your patience ran thin, for another day, and when the day came, hard or soft, you lit the lamp again, just to say, "I'm still here." And that was enough. Clothes didn't come new, not unless you were rich, truly rich. For everyone else, they came handed down, worn thin, patched once, then again and again. You didn't throw things away, you mended them because fabric cost coin and coin cost labor, and labor cost health. And you'd already spent more of each than you could afford, so you stitched, a tunic torn at the sleeve, a shawl unraveling at the edge, a sandal strap frayed to threads. You sat near the window where the light was softest, not too bright, not too dim. The needle needed just enough to find its way, and so did you. The thread was old, pulled from something else, dyed with onion skin or soaked in vinegar, tied end to end with knots that you tucked under the seams so no one would see. You didn't use a thimble. You used your thumb, calloused, quick, sore some days, but practiced. You worked in silence, or with soft voices nearby, children reciting numbers, someone boiling water, a neighbor humming off-key. The rhythm of sewing was its own kind of prayer. In, pull, smooth, knot. In, pull, smooth, knot. Every stitch held something. Not just fabric, but time, attention, care. You didn't have luxuries. You had thread, and you used it to keep the world from falling apart. Sometimes it worked. You fixed your husband's tunic so many times it no longer remembered what it used to be. A patch on a patch, sleeves tighter than they once were, a collar faded to softness. He never complained. He buttoned it slowly, then nodded, like the cloth still held him. Your daughter tore her dress climbing stairs too fast. You scolded. Then you sat and stitched. She watched your hands, not your face. But she leaned against your shoulder while you worked. That said enough. You mended a neighbor's shawl one winter. Her hands shook too much. She brought it to you in a basket with an apple. You didn't need the apple. You took it anyway. It wasn't just clothes. You mended mats, bags, netting for catching fish, curtains so thin they were more idea than barrier. You once stitched a rag doll's arm back on. A little boy had cried. Over it for days. You said nothing, just fixed it, gave it back like it had never been broken. He smiled. It was the only payment you needed that day. Mending wasn't dramatic. It wasn't remembered. But it held things together. It was resistance in a quiet way, a refusal to let things go. You could have surrendered, let the tears widen, let the seams split. But you didn't, because mending was hope. Hope that this could still be worn. Hope that this could still be used. Hope that you too could be mended. There was a tear in your own tunic that you hadn't fixed yet. Not because you didn't care, but because your children's things always came first. That night you finally sat down to repair it, threaded the needle slowly, felt the fray with your fingers. It was wider than you remembered, but not too far gone. You worked until the light faded. Then you worked a little more by the warmth of the fire. When you were done, you held it up. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And that was enough. Some might laugh, call it silly, point out that new things could be bought, but not for you. You knew the value of old things that still served, knew how to hide a patch in a fold, knew that mending was not shame. It was skill and patience and quiet, stubborn love. You laid the tunic beside your mat and rubbed the ache from your wrist. Tomorrow, something else would tear. Something else would ask for your hands, and you'd offer them, with thread and with hope. It began before the sun, the line. You couldn't see the bread yet. You didn't even smell it, but you knew it was coming. You'd heard the flour arrived the night before. Someone saw the miller, someone else heard the ovens. And so you rose quietly, pulled on yesterday's tunic and stepped outside with a coin in your palm and hope between your teeth. The queue had already formed. Women with baskets, men with sacks, children half asleep, swaying beside parents too, tired to hold them. No one spoke loudly, there was no point. The weight spoke for everyone. You found your place at the end, behind the woman with the red shawl, in front of the man who always coughed twice before speaking. You all knew each other, not by name, but by shape, by silence, by routine. The sky turned grey, then gold, then blue. Still, the line moved slowly. You watched the birds. They always seemed to get their food without waiting. They didn't queue, didn't count coins. They just swooped in and stole what they could. A boy tried that once, snatched a loaf and ran. He got as far as the next alley before someone caught him. No one beat him. But the baker didn't forget his face. That boy still came. But he waited now. Like the rest of you, you shifted from foot to foot. Your stomach reminded you why you were there. It spoke in quiet, curling aches. You told it to hush, it didn't. The line inched forward. A basket dropped. A coin rolled. Someone cursed under their breath. A baby cried. The woman with the red shawl picked it up before its mother could. She bounced it gently. The baby quieted. That was how things worked. You held each other's weight when it threatened to tip. Finally, the scent reached you. Bread, warm, earthy, soft in the middle if you were lucky. You inhaled like it was air after drowning. You clutched your coin tighter. There was always the fear that they'd run out, that the flour had been short, that your turn would come just one too late. But today, the loaves lasted. When it was your turn, the baker didn't look up, just held out his hand. You gave him your coin. He gave you the bread. It was hot. You held it with both hands like it might vanish. You didn't eat it right away. That was the rule. Not here. Not in front of the others still waiting. You stepped aside, let the next person move forward, then walked slowly home, cradling the bread like a newborn, savoring the heat through the cloth. Back in your room, the light had shifted. Someone was boiling water. Someone else was already cutting their loaf. You set yours on the table, tore it carefully, gave the end to your neighbor. He didn't ask, you didn't explain. You dipped a piece into oil, just a little, chewed slowly. The crust was thick, the inside soft. It filled your mouth, then your chest. Then the space between yesterday and tomorrow. You didn't cry, but your shoulders dropped. The kind of release that says, I made it. This far. This morning, someone knocked. A girl from upstairs. She hadn't gotten a loaf. You gave her half. Watched her carry it away like it was treasure. Because it was. Bread wasn't just food. It was proof that the system hadn't failed today. That effort still meant something. That waiting, though cruel, sometimes ended in warmth. You saved the rest, wrapped it in cloth, set it on the shelf beside the cracked bowl and the string of garlic. You'd stretch it if you had to. Tomorrow there might be another line, or none at all. But today, the bread came, and you had a piece, and you shared it. And for a little while that was everything. The day ended the way it always did, with a sigh, not from your mouth, from the room. The fire sank, the voices dimmed, The walls exhaled the heat they'd borrowed from the sun. You lay down on the floor, not because it was comfortable, but because it was what you had. A mat, a blanket, a piece of cloth folded twice to soften the spot beneath your shoulder. The floor was hard, but it was yours. It didn't move, it didn't shift. It didn't expect anything except your weight. You curled onto your side, pulled the blanket up, one hand tucked beneath your cheek, the other under your ribs, like you were holding yourself. Together. The light from the brazier painted soft gold onto the ceiling. The shadows danced. You didn't watch them for long. Beside you, someone was already snoring. Not loudly, just enough to remind you you weren't alone. You listened to the room breathe, the rhythm of sleep settling, the scrape of someone turning, the hush of cloth against skin. You didn't dream quickly. Dreams had to sneak in, past the aches, past the memories, past the long list of things you hadn't finished. You thought of your day, the bread, the stitch in your tunic, the girl who smiled at you in the market, the way your neighbor touched your hand and said, "Tomorrow." You smiled, just barely, just enough. Sleep hovered. And then the dream began. Not a story. Not really, just air. You were walking, but not tired. The road was soft, the sky was kind. And someone called your name. The real one, the one no one used anymore. You turned, but there was no one there. Just wind, just warmth. It didn't make sense, but it made you feel whole. You floated, almost. Weightless, barefoot, wrapped in something you couldn't name. A feeling, a memory, a version of yourself that hadn't yet grown tired. And in that dream, there was no Rome, no coin, no queue, no sore feet, no waiting, just breath and space and a promise you didn't need. To hear to believe. Then the rooster cried, far away, soft, polite almost, like it knew you were just beginning to rest. You didn't open your eyes, not yet. You let the dream stretch a little longer. The floor under your back was cold, but your blanket held. Your breath was steady. Your heart still yours. Someone stirred. A child whispered in her sleep. A log shifted in the fire, and still you lay there, caught between night and morning, between dream and return. You whispered, "Thank you." To no one. To everything. Then at last you slept. Rome was vast, but your world was not. Your world was four walls, a roof that creaked when the wind scolded, a doorway you patched with cloth, a floor that knew your shape better than any map. They spoke of conquest, of legions, of faraway provinces stretched like banners across the earth. But you didn't live in that Rome. You lived in the Rome that started at your threshold and ended at your neighbor's cough. Within your walls, you made the empire small enough to hold. The empire was your blanket, stitched, restitched, fraying, but warm. It was the stew that simmered too long because the fire burned low. It was the broom leaning in the corner, the pair of sandals by the door, the cup you shared when water was scarce. It was a child asking for a story. It was the silence you shared when the story ran out. It was the sound of a spoon scraping a the hush that followed a full belly. Even if it had taken all day to reach it, you didn't command troops. You commanded comfort. You knew how to place one hand on a fevered brow and the other on a crying shoulder. You remembered who liked their bread crisp and who needed it soaked in broth. In your small room, you counted things not by value, but by use. A pot with a crack still boiled water. A stool with a wobble still held weight. A coat with missing buttons still meant warmth. You were poor, yes, but never empty. The empire talked of justice and law. You talked of fairness, splitting one loaf between four, offering your only onion when someone knocked, mending someone else's tunic while your own hem frayed. In your home, time moved gently, marked not by sundials, but by sounds. The clatter of the basin, the hiss of oil, the rustle of the curtain at sunset, and when someone died there were no speeches. No marble, but the room remembered them. The way they folded their blanket, the way they laughed too loud, the smell of their soap. You whispered their name while peeling garlic. That was memory. That was Rome. There were days you thought your walls might fall, when rain came sideways, when tempers frayed, when the fire wouldn't catch. But then someone would say, "Sit," and you'd share the bench and pour the last bit of soup. And remember, the empire might rule outside, but in here you ruled too, not with power, but with care. You cleaned the room every seventh day, not because it needed it, but because it reminded you that space could be made sacred. Even dirt could be swept with grace. The empire sent orders. You sent warmth. The empire raised statues. You raised children. The empire wanted glory. You wanted tomorrow. Your walls held the weight of 1,000 small kindnesses. Every patched curtain, every quiet smile, every night you sat up to tend a fever. That was empire too. But no one carved it in stone. You didn't mind. You didn't need tribute. You had peace, occasionally, softly. Some nights, as the lamp flickered, and your eyes grew heavy, you'd look around the room, the shelf with the bowl, the spot where the sun always found your floor, the blanket curled near the wall, and you'd think, this is enough. 4 walls, a door, a name spoken softly by someone who cared. Let the empire stretch, let it shout and stomp and swell. You were home, and home, for those who made it, was the greatest kingdom of all. The lamp burns low, not because it's empty, but because the night is nearly done, and with it, the lives we've walked beside, the rooms we've stood in, the hands we've held, even if only in words. The empire never noticed most of them, not the woman stirring broth for a sick neighbor, not the man tightening his sandal with thread, not the child stacking stones and calling it joy, not the old hand brushing. Dust from a borrowed blanket. History gave us generals, statues, maps carved in marble, but it forgot to tell us what it felt like to sleep on straw that still smelled of yesterday, to cup a chipped bowl and pray it doesn't crack again, to wait in line for bread and leave with half a loaf and a full heart. The Romans built roads. Yes, but they also built walls, and not just of stone, but of silence. And in that silence lived millions of souls who never ruled anything, never wrote anything, never won anything, except another day. And that was enough. The empire roared with triumph. But behind that roar was the hum of everyday life. A mother wiping soot from a child's face. A boy learning how to knot rope. A girl singing to herself while folding clothes. They didn't need glory. They needed warmth. Not praise, just someone to sit beside. They didn't rise each day to expand borders. They rose to feed mouths, to carry water, to mend what had frayed overnight. And when the sun set and the streets grew still, they didn't ask what legacy they'd leave. They asked, is there food? Is there peace? Did I help someone today? Even their prayers were quiet, not for fortune, but for mercy, not for statues, but for sleep. Rome called itself eternal, but even eternities end. Stone crumbles, statues fall, and roads vanish beneath dust and grass. What remains are the things no monument can hold. The way someone stroked a child's hair to calm a fever. The way neighbors split bread without counting the cost. The way someone somewhere lit a lamp and whispered into the darkness, "I'm still here." Maybe that's why we tell these stories, not to glorify empires, but to remember the people who lived under their weight, the ones who sang anyway, the ones who loved anyway, the ones who endured not to be remembered, but because they couldn't afford not to. You might not know their names, but their echoes are everywhere, in the way we share, in the way we wait, in the way we make a space feel like home, even when it isn't. Tonight we've walked through cracked courtyards and broken homes, sat beside braziers, listened to footsteps, in the alleys of long-gone lives, and now the lamp flickers, the ashes cool, but somewhere in the dark, a blanket is being pulled up. A child is whispering a secret to the night, a woman is folding tomorrow's cloth, a man is closing his eyes with hunger in his stomach but peace in his chest, and somewhere Rome still breathes, not in marble, but in memory, in tenderness, in stories like this one, soft, slow, forgotten by many, but not by you. So sleep, now. Let the walls fade. Let the empire go quiet. And if you dream, may it be of warm bread, of steady hands, and of a life lived gently, even in hard times. Good night.